All right, well, as David was saying, every slot on the agenda, going first sucks in its own way. Going after lunch kind of stinks too. But going last is a blessing and a curse because, well, you're always waiting. And I've been sitting through, here for all the presentations and waiting for somebody to steal my thunder for the last presentation and kind of nervous. And David finally did it a little bit, but that's okay because I think he actually introduced a few points I want to go a little bit deeper on. And also there's a few things that I don't have in here, but I didn't really hear touched upon today, so I might raise as well. So what I want to do in this session is to go through some of the things that David and others have talked about, but maybe in a little bit more detail. There's a couple of case studies that I saw actually during my time in Cape Town and Pretoria that I think are interesting and might illuminate some of these points a little bit more. I mean, you can hear about, look at statistics and numbers and what have you, but actually hearing the human stories behind it might be a little bit more interesting. So, and I'm going to move through the things that have been covered ad nauseum. So this has been pretty well covered. A few things I would note. I mean, the issues of inequality, well covered. It's important. The second point is important. I haven't really heard it raised. With the isolation of South Africa in the 80s, to go back, in the 60s and 70s, South Africa was one of the fastest growing countries in the world. And it actually blunted some of the militancy against the apartheid regime because the white government was able to actually spend a little bit more money on social programs for non-white South Africans. Not a lot, but enough to ameliorate some of the worst conditions, for example. And so you had a fairly robust economy. But once you got into the 80s, especially after there's a famous event, the 1976 Soweto massacres, where scores of protesting school children were shot by the apartheid government. This was what started to get people's attention in the US and in Europe. And you saw the anti-apartheid movement really start to take off. And what I was just talking about before with the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act and the protests, and the bottom line is what you saw in this situation was for a decade, South Africa had almost no economic growth. And so it enters into the transition in '94 kind of stuck. So it has all of these issues related to skills shortages, which we've talked about, service delivery because the government, having no money and not really having much will, wasn't spending money on non-white citizens. And so it had to find a way to get this economy going, but then also do something about the service problems that it had. And the other two, well, the crime is a bit separate, but urbanization is something that I don't think has been emphasized too much so far. But it's important to consider that South Africa was, and still is, a very rapidly urbanizing society. There's a view of South Africa, kind of a romantic view from, we were talking about Alan Paton before, and this very bucolic place, especially for in KwaZulu-Natal, with Zulus living in villages, in the countryside, these very beautiful parts of the country. But in general, there's no economic opportunity there. I mean, it's the same reason, I went from outside of Buffalo, New York to Washington, D.C. I mean, you follow the jobs, you follow the opportunity in life. And so this is something that you've seen increasingly in the last 20 years or so, is people moving to Cape Town, people moving to Durban, people moving to Johannesburg. Gauteng province, that little province in a country of 50 million people, is about 12 million people in a relatively tiny area. So what does that mean? I mean, you've seen the pictures of squatter camps, you've seen the pictures of overcrowded settlements. What do you do about that when people just keep coming? So long story short, this is a government that came into office with a lot of challenges, some of which they've met. We saw the report card, but some of which they haven't. We've covered this a bit, but yeah, it's a few other statistics to just give you an idea. 13% of the national population with 60% of the wealth. You've seen the figures have changed somewhat, but not too much in the last few years. And then getting back to education, which I just can't really let go. But education for white South Africans we talked about the poor whites a little bit yesterday, but really from the 50s onward was a basic right of white South Africans, and an excellent education. I mean, if you got a South African matric, I mean, you were usually better qualified than your average US high school graduate. And it's still, especially in formerly white public schools and private schools today, the quality of education is outstanding. And so, in '94, I mean, 80% of whites had a high school education. However, what you saw during the apartheid years, again, alluded to a bit, but I'll go into a bit more detail, is this system of Bantu education. So this guy, Hendrik Verwoerd, who we talked about yesterday, the architect, and it really was the architect of apartheid, his idea, he, I think, basically pretty much exactly said, blacks are hewers of wood and drawers of water. We do not want black South Africans to have an education in any meaningful form other than to be able to dig ditches and perform menial work, because otherwise they pose a threat to white workers whose jobs are protected. And this is just the basic premise of apartheid. So whereas in the, really before 1960 or so, you had a pretty robust system, robust in certain places, where there were private schools for black South Africans, Fort Hare University, which was actually, I think, the first university in Southern Africa, specifically for Africans. Nelson Mandela went there, Robert Mugabe went there, several leaders from across the continent actually attended there. And after the 60s, there were still a couple of universities for black South Africans, but the amount of resources they were given was shrunk to almost zero. So you had a 30-year period wherein black South Africans were given only the most basic education. And so, voila, we're in 1994. The government is committed to providing the same sorts of services to all South Africans, but they're starting from a very, very low base of a generation, sometimes two generations, with no really discernible education. So this is, the inequality of all of this is astounding, and it still has not been resolved today. And frankly, I can't see it being resolved for another decade or two, if we're lucky. This is a relatively obscure situation here. So I want to talk about economic policy a bit. So just what I was talking about before, you had elements of the ANC, especially those that had lived abroad, studied in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, that were indoctrinated to an extent with a sort of Marxist outlook. And if you go back to the Freedom Charter, which was this document we talked about yesterday from 1955, which kind of laid out the program of the ANC. Free housing for all, the land belongs to all of the people, which can be read to mean that mines and other land should be nationalized, and so on and so forth. There's certain elements in the ANC that really took this to heart and thought, okay, we need to have a radical change in what the South African economy looks like. We need to see nationalization of mines. We need to see redistribution of farms. We need to see policies that are going to change the inequality between black and white almost immediately. Now, it's a very interesting period to read about, because the minute the ANC was unbanned in February 2nd, 1990, the international business community and the South African business community started a pretty coordinated full court press against kind of Marxist communist thinking. They set out very early on to convince Nelson Mandela and the people around him that radical changes would be an extremely bad idea for South Africa. And in large part, they succeeded. And I talk about Montfleur here. This is a vineyard outside of Cape Town where essentially all of the leading minds of business and politics, but a lot of people from the ANC, including some members of the South African Communist Party that did have more leftist tendencies in terms of their economic outlook, came together and they started walking through scenarios. Okay, what does South Africa look like under, if we change slowly, if we change quickly? And there were a couple different things mapped up, but there's two that were very pertinent here. And the Icarus solution, which is lots of government spending, subsidies, populist policies, for example, ideas of grants, dispensations of money to all citizens immediately. This would actually get the economy going, but at the same time, it would destroy the currency. Inflation would shoot through the roof. Government confidence of businesses looking to invest in South Africa would disappear altogether. And so they turned toward this one, which it's an interesting metaphor, but the flight of the flamingos. And it goes back to, if you've ever seen a flamingo take off, these things will flap their wings and they kind of go and go and go, and you're not sure if they're ever actually going to get off the ground. But then finally they start taking off. And so this was the idea, the slow approach. Let's not radicalize the economy. Let's not make drastic changes, at least not right away. There are certain things in terms of government spending. Obviously, it needs to be focused on the poorest citizens, more equal in terms of, well, even skewed towards spending on black South Africans, non-white South Africans. But let's not take a radical approach. And slowly but surely, Mandela in particular came around to this thinking very early. He traveled around the world, Western president. I mean, he, 1991, 92, visited something like 30 countries, and everywhere he went. This is 1991, 92, the fall of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall has come down, and the neoliberal ethic has sort of taken root. And so Mandela is getting this from all quarters. He's going to the, talking to George Bush. Bush is like, no, don't do this. He's going to Germany, to John Major in the UK, and they're all saying, look, take your time, do this the right way. And so this was generally the approach that the ANC took. And so, a few of the things that kind of characterized the flamingos, respect for private property. Even the second one, they probably could have gotten away with. A lot of people said, look, the apartheid government's in debt, several $billion. I mean, nothing ridiculous, but they said, we could probably write this off. We could probably say this is not a debt that we incurred. But Mandela personally said, no, we need to show the world that South Africa is a country that pays its debts, even if we weren't the government that incurred them. And just in general, I mean, neoliberal economic policies that focused on bringing in FDI, not always successfully, a consistent fight against inflation. I mean, this is a country that takes inflation very, very, very seriously. And the left, and even to this day, the left is a little bit suspicious of this. I mean, they think that if the government was focused a little bit more on government spending, if it wasn't so attentive to inflation, then you'd see more growth. I mean, you see very similar conversations happening in the U.S. right now, and really across the developed world. But this government has always kept, since '94, and this is why it gets high marks for macroeconomic policy, it has kept inflation very, very low. And then lastly, in terms of trade barriers, opening up the local market to competition, again, with the understanding that other markets would be open to South African goods. So this was, I mean, again, a broadly neoliberal economic model that they took on. But that said, I mean, there was an understanding of what they needed to do to bring non-white South Africans out of poverty. And so obviously infrastructure, housing, education, healthcare. We'll talk about all these in a little bit more detail because they show some of the successes and failures. And it's something that David just said, and I think it's the perfect word, is dilemmas. Because we're heading into an era right now of a lot of dilemmas in South Africa. Transformation, I don't want to talk about too much, but the idea was, the civil service was almost entirely white. And so you've seen a change over the last 20 years to bring black South Africans, be it, I mean, from things like being bus drivers to, I was always shocked when I got to Pretoria in '04 that you look around and the bus drivers are still all white. And it's changed a little bit, but the idea, these were job reservations under apartheid that, also getting back to some of the transformation, the ANC said, look, we're not going to fire all the white civil servants. We're not going to fire the bus drivers. We're going to let, you can retire out of that job. They'll never get promoted again, but the idea is that we'll at least protect those people in their positions. But now, the dominant paradigm of the last 20 years has been this transformation of the civil service to look more like South Africa. Black economic empowerment, we've talked about a bit as well. Broadly, it's a set of policies designed to bring black South Africans more into, better integrated into the economy, which can mean, I mean, it's a lot of different things in terms of hiring. There's a scorecard, for example. I mean, if you're a business and you're going to hire an accountant, you've got to, by law, and it's all a little bit, it's very complicated, but by law, you're supposed to meet certain scores in your BEE scorecard. So if you hire a black accountant versus a white accountant, you will get more points on that. Even a white woman versus a white male, you'll get more points. I mean, it's very convoluted, but the idea is to find ways to push business to bring more black workers into the economy. And also, another component of this too was funds set aside to essentially help black entrepreneurs buy into firms. And so this has worked out in a sense to, in certain instances, black and often connected to the ANC, individuals being given shares, pieces of companies, which in turn helps those companies become competitive for government contracts. Because if you're an entirely white-owned company competing in a contract against a company that has a pretty solid BEE scorecard, you're going to lose. So we could talk for hours about BEE, but it's a interesting element to look at, and as you're looking at papers, it's worth considering. And then also, this has been mentioned, the social welfare system in South Africa for a country, a middle-income country, we can call it rich or poor, but it's not rich by our status, but in terms of having the poorest people in society having access to government grants on a monthly basis is something you don't see anywhere else in Africa. Really, even in the developing world, this is relatively unique. So all of this came together on the back of taxes, corporate taxes, also taxes on rich individuals. So very much a system where a very small 1% is paying the taxes for most of society, which also has created some interesting debates in South Africa. And then lastly, the issue of labor laws. I think David mentioned this. It's very difficult to hire and fire in South Africa. It's very difficult to fire in general. And so this has been considered by some to be a noose or an albatross around the neck of the government in terms of what they need to do to spark economic growth. So we'll talk more about this, but this is getting into the dilemmas category. I don't like, it's a way of looking at things, and I'm not going to really do the report card or scorecard. There's a lot of different ways you can measure progress, measure failure. In South Africa, it's just very, very difficult. What is good enough? This is a really significant question. We've got an election coming up next year, and I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the latest political, the shifting winds that are going on politically. But the idea of what is good enough is something that's changed a lot in the last 20 years in terms of citizens' expectations of their government and what they demand that their government do for them. The short answer is that the first 10 years you saw a lot of progress made. And there's still progress being made. But when say you didn't have a house and now you've got a house. Well, the next thing you want is a road next to the house, and you want electricity, and you want water. And for the government, they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. The house, we could do that. We've got enough money for that. But the water, the electricity, the road, this is going to take a little bit more time. And many South Africans are saying, no, you've had enough time. It's time for you to start delivering for us. And so this is the grand debate, whether this is a government capacity issue or government could be doing things a little bit better. So I want to just walk through a few semi-case studies, and again, not to hit upon what David talked about too much and others, but one thing is that when you go to Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town, certain views you will see nothing but this. These are known as RDP houses. To back up, the government in '94, its first, I think we talked about Johnny Maloto talked about the National Development Plan, which is the latest plan. The first plan in '94 was called Reconstruction Development, I think in Prosperity, RDP. And then there was GEAR, and they've always had different plans with different acronyms. But RDP, a big component of it was housing. And so you will see these usually 3 or 4 room houses. These are pretty small. The quality is variable. But you will see these stretch for miles around the biggest cities. On one hand, it's very impressive. On one hand, it creates a few problems. So, in terms of successes, this is one thing, you've heard both perspectives on this today. The South African government holds this up as a huge success story. 3 million houses, 13 million people, and then other places where you see some of the squatter camps, when you see houses constructed from corrugated metal and cardboard and things thrown together. The government has made pretty significant strides in ensuring that they're hooked up to water. There's certain access points for water and sewage, and making the argument, look, we can't build you a house right away, but we can at least try to make your lives better in the meantime. And so this is something that continues to this day. I was just reading about, there's a plan in Cape Town for a 300,000 house settlement north of Cape Town. I mean, totally just building it in the middle of what is now the middle of nowhere. And the idea is that this would replace some of the squatter camps in places like Khayelitsha and Crossroads, some of the more very gritty townships around Cape Town. So this is, I mean, in terms of quantity and numbers, this has been a huge success story. But now, a few things. The quality. David talked about this. Some of these, I've gone out to several of these settlements. I've gotten tours of them. I've walked through the construction sites. I mean, I'm not a contractor. I can't tell you what's, if some joints are fitted correctly or not. But I mean, in general, you see, I mean, these are cinder block houses that are thrown up very, very quickly. Some of them are bound to have cracks and other problems, which problems with their foundations. South African construction can be a little bit shoddy sometimes, just in general. But so this is one complaint that's been levied quite a bit. Interestingly, in the late 80s, the apartheid government, before it saw the writing on the wall, started a pretty big program of social delivery, especially in terms of building houses. And so they didn't build all that many houses, but the houses they built were actually quite good. And so you'll go around today and talk to people in the townships, and they'll say, the white government built us better houses than we're getting now. And they're not entirely incorrect, to be quite honest with you, but the white government never built 3 million of them in a short amount of time. So this dilemma number one, is it better to go for quantity or go for quality? I mean, it's a tough question. Allocation is another big issue. You're supposed to get on a list. It's a complicated process, but the idea is if you live in a squatter settlement and they're going to build houses, you go to your local housing administration office, you sign up, you get on a list, and they'll tell you, okay, your house should be ready in 8 months. And you go back in 8 months. Who are you again? And you go back, I mean, and then you'll see, I don't know, a Zimbabwean family that has moved into a house that was supposed to be yours. Or somebody who might know the local counselor. These are the issues of petty corruption that South Africa is struggling with right now. And it's not even always corruption. A lot of this is just administrative inefficiency. I mean, this is not a place where you'll go to some offices that are computerized. You'll deal with certain departments that are very, very modern. But places like Home Affairs and Housing, you go to their offices. I mean, you're talking about people writing on pieces of paper and putting them in a file cabinet. I mean, the sorts of things we haven't done in 40 years is still going on there. So even in a best case scenario, things are bound to get lost. Urbanization, I mentioned, they can't keep pace. Pure and simply, there are more people moving to cities than the cities can keep up with. And the way South Africa allocates money to provinces, it's a minor point, but actually very, very important. They do the census every 10 years, and they say, okay, Free State has 4 million people, Gauteng has 12 million. Ergo, we have, say, $5 billion to dispense to the provinces every year, so we give it out by population. And so, but it takes 10 years, and so in that 10 years, your more rural provinces are actually getting a bigger cut of the pie than they actually deserve because the populations are moving into the cities. And so the cities are stuck with this situation where they cannot build, they do not have the money to build housing fast enough. And the Helen Zille, who's the leader of the DA, and she's now premier of Western Cape, got in trouble a couple years ago, a little tempest in a teapot, where she was asked about this, why can't you keep up with housing in Cape Town? And she said, well, influx controls, which were the pass laws against blacks moving to cities. So, well, influx controls don't exist anymore. We can't do anything about that, which some people took the wrong way. But she was making the point that, look, we can't stop people from coming to cities. This is where the jobs are. And if we don't have the money to build houses, we can't keep up. Favoritism, contracts, who's getting these contracts? Sometimes when we see these houses that are of shoddy quality, it comes back to when you start tracing who got the contract, it turns out to be a buddy of the minister or the provincial legislator who may have never built a house in his life, but somehow was able to get a dodgy company up and running. This has happened more than you'd think. And another issue that's going to be increasingly, something we talk about in the States quite a bit, but urban planning. I mean, if you go to Cape Town, we saw that picture, Johnny Malota showed it this morning, the other side of the mountain. And the other side of the mountain goes for a long way. You've got your city bowl, which is your previously white, very, very expensive real estate. Then you get over the mountain out into the Cape Flats, and you've just got miles and miles and miles of squatter camps and housing developments like this. And the problem is, how do you get from there to your job in the city? They don't have means of effective public transport. And so more and more, urban planners are saying we have to build up, we have to build density. But then all of the financial people are saying, well, we can't afford to do that. We've got to build out. That's the only way that we can keep up with demand. And so they're getting to a point where the roads are so congested that it's actually not making sense for people to even move to the cities, because it's taking people 3-4 hours every morning just to get from where they live to where they work. It's a very serious situation that doesn't get a lot of attention. So water, just a few statistics. This is also something held up by the government as a huge success story. 93% have clean water, 83% with access to electricity. The government focused on this a lot early on. And this is something, especially in urban areas, it's kind of an easy win. I mean, it's not difficult to go to a township and string up wires between houses, right? I mean, where you've got dense populations, you can do this in a relatively inexpensive, quick fashion. Same for water and sewage. The buckets, I mean, this is a terrible, so it still exists. About 1% of South Africans have this, is where you don't have sewage, you actually put your waste in a bucket and you hang it out every night. And some guy will come along and collect your waste every morning. Or, well, not every morning, which is the problem. So they've almost completely eradicated this, but not quite there. But overall, I mean, these are pretty good numbers by most perspectives. Now, however, there's a few other problems. First of all, they've gotten the easy wins. The first 10 years, from 94 to 2004, the government was able to go to Soweto, go to Alexandra, the various townships that, again, were very dense, very quick and easy to hook up. But now, okay, you've got that. Now you're looking at places in the Transkei, which is a former homeland in the Eastern Cape. I mean, very rural areas that, okay, so-and-so lives up on a hill, there's a little village of 5 people. It'll cost $10 million to build the infrastructure to take water or electricity to that little village on the hill, whereas that $5 million could give water and electricity to 1,000 people in a city. So now point is, it just gets harder and harder and harder for a government to make progress, to show progress to its people. And then also, this is an electricity meter that you'll find in pretty much every house in township. Even informal settlements will have these. And so, for a long time, you saw the wires strung into these townships. So you had electricity up there, great. And most people, ostensibly, you were supposed to pay for it, but there's easy ways to rig wires and get your house hooked up. But in the last few years, they've rolled out these meters, and they said, okay, and water has a similar system, where water's easier. By law, you have access to, how many, say, I don't know, I can't remember the number, but say 20 liters of water a day. So every house is entitled to 20 free liters of water. But everything over that costs you money. And to get access to that, you have to go to, the way it works, you go to the supermarket, and you just go to a till and you can actually buy credits. So you buy 100 Rand worth of water and you punch it into your meter. And electricity, even my house in Cape Town had this. I had to go to the gas station and buy electricity. So I'd put 500 Rand, about 80 bucks onto a little receipt, and I'd go home and I'd punch in the number, and then voila, I'd have electricity. And electricity is the same way. You have right to so many kilowatts per day or what have you. So increasingly, you've got a lot of South Africans who, okay, the last 10 years I've gotten a house, I've gotten access to electricity, I've gotten access to water, but wait, now I got to pay for it? I don't have the money for that. How do I choose between electricity and then say, having the money to go to work? And so this has become a very, very controversial element in South African society, especially among poor South Africans. And it's not getting any better because one thing the apartheid government did, it actually overbuilt its electricity network. So in 1994, they were actually mothballing plants left and right. So you had all of this excess capacity in the system. And so for a good decade and a half, South African electricity was the cheapest electricity in the world. A lot of coal, not a lot of, demand was low, and so you could basically just burn as much electricity as you wanted. They did not expect, I talked about the economic growth this morning, but even the economic growth of 3-4% was enough to destroy that excess capacity almost overnight. And so Eskom, the electricity parastatal, is now struggling to find the money to build new plants, and in 2009 they had brownouts across the country because they finally hit the point where they had no spare capacity. So bottom line, Eskom wants to raise rates by 60% over the next few years. So, which is a massive, if you think about it, think of your electric bill being raised by 60%. That's a massive increase. But they're saying to keep the country supplied with electricity, they have to do this. And so this is another one of those dilemmas that you're going to see become increasingly difficult in South Africa. So I don't think anybody thought they were going to talk about toilets today, right? But this is actually a really interesting case study. So let's just talk about Cape Town. The picture that Melota showed is excellent. That's essentially the view from Khayelitsha. You look out and you see Table Mountain in the distance, and it is this very gritty, windswept township outside of Cape Town, built in the 80s. And it was simply an issue of, the apartheid government had to park all of these people coming from the Eastern Cape to Cape Town, this first wave of urbanization. And so there's some formal settlements, some houses built by the apartheid government, and more that have been built. Khayelitsha itself is several 100,000 people just outside of Cape Town. And in 2000, also as was mentioned, the ANC has only controlled Western Cape in one election between 2004 and 2009. And so it's historically been this very interesting political entity that is a mix of white, colored, and increasingly black South Africans. So since 2006, Cape Town has been controlled by the Democratic Alliance, which is this party long viewed as a liberal party, long viewed as the white opposition in South Africa. And the party under Helen Zille has made its name on service delivery. They have said we are going to be more efficient than the ANC. We're going to make sure that electricity, housing, education. We all have the same policies. If you read the DA policy statement and the ANC policy statement, they look almost exactly the same. The DA has just said we're not corrupt. We're going to do it better, and they've been pretty impressive. In general, Cape Town, I've seen the difference. Just living there and visiting there before, Cape Town is a much more livable city. And Cape Town, the city of Cape Town covers Khayelitsha as well. And so the local government, which has certain competencies, has said, embarked on various projects. But one of them, they went out to Khayelitsha and they said, look, we can, basically right here, they went to community leaders and they said, look, we've got X amount of money in our sewage budget. And with that money, we can go around to every house here, and I think it's the next, so 1,300 houses, and we can build you a toilet right outside your house. But you got to cover it. We're not going to, half the cost for us is putting up a concrete block house around each toilet, what have you. We're going to give you the toilet, and then you do what you will. Does that sound good? Yes, no? And most people in Khayelitsha said, yeah, bring it on. That's perfect for us. And so they did this, and they seemingly without controversy, and they built 1,300 toilets. And then after about, I think 2008 is when they started this, and about 2010, there were still a few uncovered. And the ANC leaders, especially the Youth League, especially this guy Malema, who we talked about yesterday and today, seized upon this. Now let's back up and look at the political spectrum. The ANC is a party that politically is under increasing stress nationwide. The ANC in 1994, between 94 and 09, has taken between 65% in national elections. They haven't had much opposition. And a lot of this, especially for the first couple of elections, it was Nelson Mandela as candidate. Who's going to vote? What black South African is going to vote against Nelson Mandela? He really is the father of the country. Really a figure responsible for South Africa's liberation. And so the ANC has played on this ever since '94. And I've seen this at election time, and they're very good at it. But they'll go around and say, by the way, don't forget who brought you your freedom. Don't forget that the ANC is responsible for this. Now, in 1994, that worked. In 1999, in 2004. Well, then, increasingly, though, if you're born in 1994, and the first, actually, this next election next year is the first time that those born in 1994 will be voting. Well, they don't remember apartheid. They don't, they know who Nelson Mandela is, but that's their parents' generation. I mean, this is the sort of thing that they didn't experience firsthand. And so these groups are increasingly skeptical of the ANC, black, white, what have you. I mean, there was a question earlier about whites within the ANC. I mean, there are none left. I mean, there are no young whites joining the ANC. No young Indians either. Very few young colored South Africans too. And increasingly, you see black South Africans just skeptical of what the ANC is doing. I mean, it is a what have you done for me lately sort of situation. So the ANC, to go back to them, in Western Cape, and Cape Town, they're a spent force. I mean, they're actually struggling right now to be relevant. And they only, in local elections in 2011, they only got about 35% of the vote, which is, they've never been strong in Western Cape, but that was a pretty significantly low number. And so you saw ANC leaders in the city, okay, I mean, think about an American political context. Where can you score political points? You always go for the easy wins. And so ANC leaders started saying, well, this is racist. This is the DA not respecting black people, not covering toilets, and especially the Youth League under Malema started destroying the toilets. Here, well, this one wasn't destroyed, but there were a couple of toilets they would have. I would go out and there'd be big groups around them. But yeah, but they would go through and started smashing up the toilets and saying this is a symbol of racist arrogance on behalf of the DA. So, and the courts actually, they took it to the courts, and the courts finally actually ruled that the city had to cover these toilets. The city then just went out of its way and removed them, which they were told by the courts not to do. It became very ugly and just a little bit weedy. But I mean, this is, the point I want to make is that these are the tough choices South Africa is facing more and more. This is a rich country, but it's not an unlimited, this is not a place, this is not Qatar, this is not Saudi Arabia, where there's oil money flowing in and they can do whatever they want. It's still a country of limited resources, and you've got to make decisions in this case. So it comes down to, are we going to spend $1 billion on schools, or are we going to spend $1 billion on toilets and sanitation? And people, the fraying tempers is another issue. People are fed up. I mean, life in these townships is a gritty existence. I mean, this is a tough place to live. Especially out in the Cape Flats. I mean, this was land that was not meant to be inhabited. It's dusty, it's sandy, it's windy, it's cold in the winter, blazing hot in the summer. And when you're living in a tin shack, it's a really, utterly and completely miserable existence. And so people 20 years on are saying, why isn't our situation better? And tempers are fraying. I mean, you are really starting to see people become more and more upset specifically with the ANC government. And what it has turned to, and we talked about this as well, service delivery protests. Now, these are not, I want to say this up front, these are not solely over service delivery. There are times when politicians, especially rival factions of the ANC, get close to election time, and one faction will start turning on the other faction and rioting over service delivery when it's really a political front. But it's hard to know what's what. But in general, though, we've seen 3,000 protests between 2009 and 12, something that we did not see in any significant number before 2009. Again, the motivations are always a little bit unclear, but in general, very broadly, this is a sign of South Africans becoming very fed up with the system. And getting into, just to touch on the political issues as well, voting for the DA as a black person 5 years ago was unheard of. The DA has focused, to just give you a bit of background, in '94 the DP, as it was then called, the Democratic Party, got something like 1.5% of the vote in the first election. And it was a white, English-speaking liberal party, focused, very neoliberal in its economic outlook. And it had a leader named Tony Leon after that. And Leon did something very interesting. He became a total pit bull against the ANC. And they had one slogan in 1999, which was "Fight Back." which was viewed by especially those on the left as just a repulsive slogan. I mean, kind of, okay, this ANC government, almost a racist slogan. This ANC government is not living up to it. We, speaking to the white community, need to fight back and organize. And they ended up winning 10% of the vote. And ever since then, they've been slowly and steadily growing and moving away from being viewed, however, as a solely white party. They've picked up support from the colored community, the Indian community, and really increasingly black South Africans who are fed up with the ANC. In 2009, the last national election, for example, the DA got about 1% of the black vote. And then in 2011, local elections, it's a different paradigm, but in general it reflects growth. The DA got about 7% of the black vote. So still very low. But I was actually out on election day in 11 around Port Elizabeth in some of the black townships north of town. And I saw, I mean, it just amazed me to see black South Africans wearing Democratic Alliance t-shirts. I mean, anyhow, it's a shift in mentality that is coming in the South African body politic. Where it's going, nobody really knows quite yet. I mean, the ANC is a very resilient party. It certainly could rebound. But people, especially in disadvantaged areas, are starting to see this ANC is not being very responsive to them. And the DA, Cape Town is viewed as the most well-governed city probably in Africa. I knew some of the DA guys well, and I asked, like, what's the secret? And one guy said, hire engineers and listen to what they say. It's like running a city is really easy. All you have to do is keep the trains running. Okay, if they say build a road there, build a ditch there, you build a road there, you build a ditch there. You don't waste the money. You make sure the money goes to where it's supposed to go. Corruption in South Africa, so what corruption is a debatable topic. But the point is, this is, like I was saying, this is not a rich country. So if 10% of a budget is being skimmed off the top, that 10% can make a big difference, and especially in terms of political support. And the DA realizes this. It's a highly, their administration in Cape Town and Western Cape are highly considered almost incorruptible, and they have the results to show for it. So you're seeing, what's interesting is black South Africans from the Eastern Cape province, this group that, traditionally very, very strong ANC supporters, move to Cape Town and they say, wow, things actually work a lot better here than they did back home. And they call their friends back home and say, wow, this DA government actually isn't so bad. And so, anyhow, to get at the political issue, slowly but surely you're seeing this realignment. It's not going to happen in 2014, I can guarantee you that. 2019, 2024, debatable. I mean, there's a lot of factors up in the air, but we are seeing the change. I won't belabor this too much. I mean, the inequality problems remain very, very difficult problems for South Africa. You're seeing, another dilemma that you see faced. You see this excellent system of social welfare grants being handed out, but you're also seeing, more and more criticism too of, well, is welfare a drag on the economy? Is welfare keeping people from seeking employment? Which actually, again, another debate that we've heard in the US over the years. But, the idea of, is this the right balance? Questionable. BEE, the economy still remains very much in white hands. I mean, the statistic, David used the same statistic. It's 50% higher, but still ridiculously low. And skills. And I go back at it again. Spending on education is about the same as the US and UK in terms of GDP. But in terms of turning out non-white secondary graduates, it's very, very slow going. And it's getting there, hopefully. I mean, for example, the matric test, which is, consider it like your SAT and your final test in high school. If you pass the matric with a certain grade, you can go to university. If you pass it with such a lower grade, you can go into like a 2-year school. And last year, actually, they just released the results, and there was a pretty good uptick in the matric results. However, then there's also allegations, the test has been dumbed down through the years. So another kind of controversial point that nobody really knows what it means. But the point is the number of South African graduates, skilled graduates, is nowhere near what it needs to be. Unemployment, and the one thing I want to say about unemployment is I always say this: South Africa does not have an unemployment problem. It has a skills problem. And I say that because whenever I would get the Sunday Times, they still have the big old massive newspapers that come every Sunday, and I swear half of that newspaper was want ads. And I would read through them, and it's, IT, nursing, the kind of careers that, in the US, it's a kind of a 2-year associate's degree program. These are the sorts of things where there is a massive demand in South Africa. And even for even things that high school graduates would be qualified for. But the problem is even at that level, you're not seeing the graduates. And so, David made the right point. There's sadly, there's really no hope for a lot of these unskilled South Africans, especially those that are a little bit older. These are, they can dig ditches or build roads or work on farms, but this is not employment that is going to contribute a great deal to the GDP or really to their livelihoods. And so, but like he was also saying, this is not actually nobody really said this. This is not really a cheap place to find labor. This is not Vietnam or China a few years ago where you could go in and set up a textile plant and have people work for pennies a day. Because there are such strong labor protections in South Africa, wages tend to be fairly high. And so what I alluded to earlier in terms of inflexibility in the labor market is a big problem. So if you've got a bunch of skilled scientists, I don't know, if you're a country turning out scientists, okay, you can have an inflexible labor market isn't going to be a big deal because you need those skills anyhow. You're not likely to fire them. But if you don't have the skills in your economy, if you need to find a way to employ people, but you can't employ them for less than a certain minimum wage, then the question arises, how do you actually incorporate them into the economy? I'm going to move through this a little bit because we're running a little short on time and I want to talk about foreign policy a bit. But the point is in health we've talked about, we've seen some changes, not nearly as quick as probably should be. And then also, let's not think about AIDS. TB, obesity, cancer, these are other problems that are increasingly a problem in South Africa. Crime, it's still a dangerous place. I'll throw that out there. It has gotten better, but South Africa is still an extremely violent society with, somebody I was chatting with earlier, a gun culture that is still very, very deeply entrenched in South African society. And it's not very difficult to get an illegal gun. They've passed some gun control laws that have tried to eliminate this. When I was in Pretoria, I went out with a buddy of mine who took me to the townships, and he's like, hey, got to meet a friend of mine. He's a gangster. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So we go in this guy's house, and he's like, yeah, what do you, you need a gun? I'm like, no, but thanks for asking. He's like, well, look, I can get you a 9mm for $250, about $30. I'm like, really? How do you do that? It's like, oh, it's simple. I go to the police station, and I've got my buddy on the inside. So whenever there's a gun that they arrest somebody, he's got an illegal gun, they throw it in the safe. And because nothing's computerized, they write up a little ticket, and they put it in the file cabinet. And so I was like, I need a gun. I just call my buddy, hey, get me a 9mm and take the file. And they just go in the gun safe and steal it and give it to him. I mean, that's an egregious case of police corruption. But this is the sort of thing that still happens. And the point is, in terms of illegal guns, they're still fairly easy to get. Agricultural, nobody's really talked about agriculture today, and it's also problematic. I mean, it's a huge contributor to the South African GDP and for employment. But in terms of especially getting more black ownership of farms, this is something the government struggled with. Global warming, climate change is something for the biggest carbon producer in Africa. They talk a good game about climate change, but they could be doing more. Please.
Quick thing about agriculture. I guess you mentioned earlier in the morning that the percent of the GDP that was from agriculture had dropped. Is that happening on purpose? Are they trying to not focus so much on it, or is it a bad thing?
It depends who you talk to. I mean, it's agriculture. It's diminishing, but I think that's actually more a reflection of other sectors growing, rather than a real diminishment of. There's some farms that have farms have shrunk but become more productive, which I think also contributes to this. It's a good. I don't really know technically what it's all about, but No. One problem in South Africa, it's somebody told me this, the wheat crop in South Africa in global commodities markets is considered the most volatile crop in the world, because it all depends on if you get 3 inches of rain or 5 inches of rain. And anything in between there, you can go, I mean, there's a lot of water scarcity in South Africa. There's some irrigated agriculture, but not a lot. You're still heavily dependent on rains. And so, frankly, it's not a big, if I'm the government, I'm not really throwing all my money down on agriculture, because it's just, and especially with this last point, global warming, climate change is starting to affect the system. Energy is another problem. I mentioned that. Transport, urbanization. A few things about foreign policy. I mentioned a bit of this before. The idea is after '94, South Africa is trying to find a way to play a leading role, to be a leader on the continent, but not kind of dominate its neighbors. And then pushing, Thabo Mbeki was a big proponent of this, pushing for good governance, democratization, all of these positive things on the continent. But also looking at the global north, at Europe and the US, hey, we're Africa, we want to be seen on equal footing with you guys. But then at the same time, South Africa has a very different trade relationship with the US and Europe than the rest of the continent. And so, just think about this today, the one finished product that is really imported by the US, really even probably the Western world, from South Africa, or from Africa, are catalytic converters. I mean, this is one thing that South Africa actually produces, because they've got the platinum mine. So there's actually a big industry of turning out catalytic converters and finished automobiles in South Africa. So, but what I'm saying is this is a very different trade model than you see elsewhere on the continent. And so while they're trying to be leaders of Africa and trying to push an African agenda, they're not really technically part of this African agenda. So it's created a bit of a dichotomy in terms of what they're trying to do. Mbeki is extremely involved in the foreign policy agenda. I mean, Mbeki is a controversial political figure. I think probably more sympathetic than he's given credit for right now. History will make him look a bit better. But in terms of solving African conflicts, he was extremely active. And in terms of building the African peacekeeping capacity through things like the African Union, made big strides. I wish I had more time to talk about defense policy, but now I've raised it, you can write about it in your papers. A very quick overview. In 1982, South Africa was spending 5% of its GDP on defense. I mean, this is the Cold War South Africa I was alluding to. A massive mobilization of the defense industry. I mean, something like 22% of its budget just on defense. And so 1994 comes, there's no enemy anymore, and so they say, okay, we've got to slash defense. And so, and they did. They're spending something like 1.2% of GDP on defense right now, which is, there's a NATO minimum of 2%. And bottom line is they're letting their defense forces kind of decay, which I think is a bit sad. But Mbeki, even though they didn't have the manpower to do it, actually deployed 3,500 troops at its peak across the continent doing peacekeeping. And so very helpful for these deployments, but they've utterly decimated the military. I mean, you can't not spend money. You can't say go there and not give you the money to do it. And so the military is a bit strained by all of this. And this is the big point. They've had these outsized ambitions, especially under Mbeki, but not really the means to do it. I mean, Mr. Moloto said this today. They've got 135 diplomatic missions around the world. That's a lot. And believe me, the amount of diplomats you need to staff these missions, the amount of money that this costs, is not an insignificant figure. And so this is the question that they've got to struggle with. And especially in terms of if it's going to be building a school or building a clinic in a rural area or opening an embassy in Mali. This is a country where these are the sorts of decisions that have to be made. They've tried, outsized ambitions, they've tried to mediate in the Middle East. Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish said, we don't really need South African intervention, thank you very much. Their deputy foreign minister went to Iraq before the outbreak of the Iraq war to try to stop the war. Again, totally outsized ambitions, but no real means by which to push them. They've tried to say, we need UNSC reform. We need a permanent African member on the UN Security Council. Of course, then South Africa and Nigeria both say, well, maybe it should be us. So, I mean, it's also created various rivalries. On the UNSC, they raise this human rights agenda, but they don't. If you read Mandela is credited with an article in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs in 1993 that says this is what a South African foreign policy is going to be under the ANC. And it heavily emphasized this human rights agenda. But yet, they've refused visas for the Dalai Lama to come to South Africa. They've stood with China. They've stood with Zimbabwe. Let's just say squaring their human rights focus with their actions has been pretty problematic. You've probably heard about Zimbabwe. I won't go too much in depth. Zimbabwe in 2000, really from the 90s, started to have this huge political decline under Robert Mugabe, turned into an economic decline. Between 2000 and 2008, the Zimbabwean economy declined about 40%, which is massive. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Zimbabweans going to South Africa. And at home, Mbeki said, look, we're engaging in quiet diplomacy. We're trying to push our neighbor to make positive changes. But he was savaged in the South African press and internationally. Look, if Canada was collapsing, would the U.S. stand by and let this happen? I mean, that was one of the comparisons that was made. And so the government, though, also rightly or wrongly said, look, we're not going to go overthrow Mugabe. I mean, that's not what we do as a government. That's not the principles that we believe in. And so things are finally turning around in Zimbabwe, but no thanks to South Africa. And it is questionable whether they could have actually influenced Mugabe. The long story short, going forward, South Africa since Mbeki has minimized foreign policy. There is more of a focus at home. And there's not really any big push to be a foreign policy player. And then what is national interest? I've talked to many leading South African academics who have said over and over again, we'll have these debates, then we'll come back to, well, what is our national interest? They said the whole room goes quiet. We're like, well, we don't actually know. Why do we have a foreign policy? Why do we have a military? Why do we do X, Y, and Z? What is it that motivates us? The fact that this is still a debate 20 years on is very telling, because it also gets back to the complexity of this country. What exactly it wants out of the world, where it wants to be in the world, where it wants to be in Africa, among the BRICS. The point was very well made. It is the small s in the BRICS. It really is nothing like the rest of the BRICS. So where does it fit? This is something South Africa is still searching for. This is the last slide. This is the question I always would ask smart people in South Africa. I say, could any government have done anything any different? Is it about policy? And most people have said, look, this is probably the best outcome that we could have had in terms of building houses, especially a lot of the domestic policies. Foreign policy is a little bit trickier. But the problems are structural. I mean, these are things that are very, very deep-rooted that were created 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And there's one stream of thought that says, oh, we can't keep blaming apartheid for everything. But there's another that I tend to agree with, that no, as much as you can't blame apartheid, but you can acknowledge the fact that apartheid created such massive inequalities in the system, such massive skills deficits, and really, disenfranchised generations of South Africans, that it is going to take a long time for South Africa to recover from this. And so what's good enough? That's going to be up for South Africans to decide. And we'll see at the polls in 2014 and 2019. So that's all I've got. I think prompts and questions are probably in order. I'm sure everybody wants to go, but if you've got questions, I'm happy to take them. Please.
One slide said global warming is a concern. Who is concerned? Is the government concerned? And what are they doing about it as far as pollution? Are they not thinking about air pollution?
Yeah. Okay, the government talks a very good game, and they hosted one of the climate, I think it was in Durban in 2011, if I remember correctly, but they've hosted one of the big global conferences on it. And they talk a lot about clean energy and green energy, solar, wind, and they're investing in it. I mean, they've actually created some tax incentives for firms looking to invest in those sorts of energies. Nuclear is another one that's coming up. They have one nuclear plant right now. They're talking about building more. That said, South Africa is a massive polluter. I mean, most of their power plants, if you drive into Joburg on many days, there's just a layer of smog over Joburg. I mean, something you haven't seen in the US in many, many years. And so as much as they acknowledge the need and talk about trying to find ways to address global warming, they're not really living up to it, not yet. And this gets back to the difficult choices they have to make. I mean, they don't have the money to invest in a massive green energy system. And so they said, well, yeah, we'd like to change, but we just can't do it right now. So it's a mixed bag. I think that's the short answer. Please. Yep.
What do you see as being more likely in the future, that Democratic Alliance more support will fracture off some different
Yeah, that's a very good question. The question being, is it going to be the DA that poses a challenge, or is the ANC going to fragment? Believe me, that's a question that's asked very, very frequently. And what you're going to see more than likely, I mean, for example, just the other day, it's important to consider there are 200 political parties, more than 200 registered in South Africa. Probably about 18 with seats in parliament. So you get a seat in parliament, you only need to get 0.25% of the vote. So out of 400 seats, it's divvied up that way. And so you see political representation, it's not just the DA and ANC. So a couple things are going on. First of all, the small parties are all kind of shaking out. They're trying to figure out how they're going to align. I think some small parties are actually going to end up disappearing. And then inside the ANC, you've got these, the ANC has always been called, and very truly, a big tent. So you've got the guy I mentioned earlier, Trevor Manuel, who was Minister of Finance for a long time, very strong neoliberal voice. And then you've got members of the South African Communist Party who have espoused much more leftist policies. But even on the political left, people talk about the left like it's one giant entity. You've got people who point out very rightfully that the unions, who are considered the left of the ANC, well, union policies are not pro-poor policies necessarily. The union wants to preserve jobs for people who have them already, not necessarily to create jobs. So there's an increasing schism within the ANC too, sniping at the union, saying that no, the policies that you want are not really truly pro-poor policies. So why do people stay in the ANC? That's been a big question. I mean, one of the lines of thinking is that it's easier to affect change from within than to be outside the tent and trying to do it from there. And also you've seen a couple of, there was a party that split off in 2008 called the Congress of the People, which was several senior Mbeki allies who everybody thought was going to be the next big thing in South African politics, and then got 3% of the vote in the election, something pathetic. And so there's also, so that's a big lesson learned, is that if you leave the ANC, not really, good things don't necessarily happen if you leave the ANC, if you try to start your own thing. Because the last point I make, South African politics is not cheap, and it's getting more and more expensive by the day. And there are no laws in South Africa that govern campaign finance whatsoever. And so if you're the ANC, they've got their own investment wing. They've got other means by which they can raise money very quietly. This is where the issues of corruption, defining what corruption is. Things that we would consider corrupt practices in the US are not considered legally corrupt practices in South Africa in terms of influence and what you need to report. And so the ANC is a bit of a gravy train. There's a lot of money there. And so if you, especially for your politicians who are not ideologues, and there's sadly more of them than we'd like, but are in it for the contracts, in it to make money, leaving the ANC is catastrophic. And so, bottom line, I don't see the ANC crumbling anytime soon. I think the interests holding the party together are still stronger than the ones pulling it apart. Please.
How much influence has US or other countries have in economic reforms right after 1994?
Oh, in terms of the neoliberal?
Forming their
A great deal. I mean, it really was. Mandela did go on the Western capital tour. I mean, Mandela it was a time, when you look at the transition and the reasons why the transition happened, I mean, the fall of the Cold War can't be understated. And so Mandela went out into a world, I mean, think about it, he'd been in prison for 30 years. I mean, really not exposed to, just exposed to the world. And so, he's going to these Western capitals. And at first, he came out kind of espousing some of the more leftist ANC rhetoric, kind of sounding like he came from 1962. And he got educated very quickly and going around the world and everybody saying, no, you can't do that. You're going to destroy your country if you make these changes. So especially early on, there was a great deal of influence on that.
we kind of alluded to 1990s economic policies in a similar way for like China. The economic policies have been like very successful in 1980.
Mhm.
From then you see all this economic boom and everything. So I was wondering, like, similarly, does South Africa has taken up any liberalization of the private sector in terms of economic policies to boost its economy?
That's a tough one. Their policy, like I kind of pointed out, it's been a bit of a mishmash. It's been some stops to the left, but then also a general neoliberal framework. The problem is, especially, for example, if you look at state-owned enterprises, South African Airways, Eskom, which are a very significant part of the South African economy. There's still a lot of complaints over their management and to the degree to which they've been liberalized and opened up to foreign investment, for example. It depends. Where you sit is where you stand. People on the left say the economy has been liberalized way too much. Those on the right, I mean, if you're talking to an American centrist economist, they would look at the South Africa and say there's a lot of room to kind of open up the economy. That said, when the global financial system was collapsing and banks everywhere were falling left and right, South African banks, it was a slide earlier today, and it's actually quite true. South African banks are some of the healthiest in the world. And actually, they passed something called the National Credit Act in around 2006-07, before the global economy started tanking. And the NCA mandated, way too detailed and technical for me, but generally it mandated, look, banks can't give out loans to people who can't afford to pay them back. There were much more stringent, a lot of the things that we've seen implemented here after the crisis were implemented there before. And so, of course, you had people complaining and saying, oh, why are you putting unnecessary restrictions on the banks? Then you saw the financial collapse. And you've seen, and you'll hear South African critics, South Africans don't like to be criticized. I mean, nobody does, but South Africans can be very touchy about it. And they'll say, well, look what you just destroyed your whole financial system, and maybe you should take a little bit, be a little bit more considerate about the laws that you pass and being too quick to deregulate everything. Tough question, but it's a good one to explore. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, that was related to the steps. Has South Africa taken many steps to liberalize the economy, and what has it done? Oh, yes.
So this may be a little off topic from what you were talking about.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about women and how rape culture in South Africa might not be as prevalent as it is in the rest of the continent?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I wouldn't necessarily say it isn't as prevalent. I mean, there still is, on paper, the culture, the Constitution of South Africa, oh, sorry. Oh, repeat the question, sorry. The culture of rape in South Africa, and whether it's less or more prevalent in South Africa than elsewhere. And I would say that, especially in, I'm trying to think especially where. There is a huge problem of violence against women in South Africa. The Constitution and other laws are very strong and straightforward about protecting the rights of women, but enforcement, police enforcement, cultural norms don't always stand up for women's rights. And so you've had some horrific stories. There was a very horrific story recently of a woman gang raped and murdered outside of Cape Town. You've had issues of rape of lesbians. As much as, again, gay rights, for example, have been accepted on paper since 1994. But if you go into rural communities, especially in the black and colored communities, and even in white communities in rural areas, the attitudes toward gay South Africans are still stuck in 100 years ago. And so you've seen certain situations where lesbians have been raped to turn them straight. I mean, that sort of brutality. And so these sorts of things still do exist. And especially in rural areas, and it is, I would say, still very much a patriarchal society. I mean, in all of the cultures. And so there is a reticence on behalf of women to, as much as there is a push by the police and the government to tell women it's okay to report cases of rape and sexual abuse, there's still a hesitancy in South African society to do so. And so it's a problem. I would just say overall, it still remains a very big problem. And on the plus side, South African society is open enough where you do have a media, television, print media. I mean, there are campaigns, there are billboards. It's talked about. The government has made it okay, and civil society has made it okay to talk about these issues. But the point is, especially like even sexual behaviors from the excellent lecture on HIV earlier, it takes a long time to change sexual behaviors. It takes a long time to change cultural attitudes and attitudes against, toward women, toward homosexuals, et cetera, et cetera. So hope that somewhat answers it. Sure. Yes, please.
What strategic interest the United States might foresee in South Africa in the coming decade?
So strategy in what sense?
Geopolitical, military, anything else?
U.S. Toward South Africa?
Can foresee in South Africa.
Oh, can foresee in.
Decade.
I see. South Africa, it's funny because this is, an exercise that, we're constantly talking about, in the department. I mean, we do this for all countries. Where do we see the world going? South Africa, the general perspective is, South Africa is not a country that I think people really worry about. South Africa is the ultimate mixed bag. There are a lot of things, like I mentioned, throughout the day, we've heard throughout the day, that are very positive. I thought Mr. Moloto's, there's a lot of little bits in his presentation that I hadn't even known. I mean, there's just some very positive things going on in South Africa. But at the same time, some of the structural issues, the issues of inequality, the issues of skills, we don't see them getting much better in the near term. So we don't, bottom line, this is just my personal view, I don't see South Africa taking off like this. I also don't see it going down like this. I see South Africa generally, I'm still, I wouldn't say a South Africa optimist, but I'm always South Africa hopeful. I mean, it is just personally a country I love very much, and I want to see it do well. So my hope is that the flamingos keep flapping, and you do start to see improvements in education. You do start to see, one interesting thing with the global economic crisis is actually you saw a lot of the brain drain that left South Africa come home. You saw something like 1.6 million whites leave the country from '94 to 2004. And a lot of them are coming back. I mean, people who thought the country was going to collapse have realized 20 years on, okay, this is not a place we have to worry about it collapsing. I mean, there's still worries about crime and everything else, but people are South Africans, I think, are starting to have more confidence in their country. And African immigrants are starting to have more confidence in their country. So there are some positive developments going on, but it's not going to be very rapid. Any final takers? No? Thank you all very much. You've been very attentive. It's a lot to take in one day, believe me, so you guys have done great.